Kind of like a takeoff, lift off.
Five, four, three, two, one.
Good morning. And welcome to Lyceum, or better known as Sunday School at Casadega Spiritualist Camp Meeting Association. And on behalf of everyone and the Board of Trustees, our pastors, and myself, we welcome you here this morning. Yes, this is my first Lyceum, so let's see where this goes. All right. I'd like to start off by offering a prayer. Please take an attitude of prayer. God, Spirit, infinite intelligence, I ask for you to go forth today and guide my thoughts, my words, my actions, that they may fall upon ears that I would be helping to understand or open doors of new dimensions and horizons. And in that I say, amen and thank you. All right. In my spiritual development, since I was a kid, little tiny kid, I have my earliest memories of a fascination with death and dying. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why. It just was. As a child, I would observe birds and other small animals that would be dead alongside the road or in the forests. As a child, I was raised in Iowa. We had cornfields on one side of us. We had race horses and pasture lands of farms on the other side, all flanked by huge, deep forests and woods, which had multiple paths in them. So I was very fortunate as a child to be able to run free in all of these little areas. And in these areas, in the pastures and in the cornfields, I would find these cow bones, cow skulls, entire skeletons. And I would stand there fascinated by them. While my friends would be running around doing their thing, I'd be standing there staring at this. And all sorts of things would be going through my head. How did they get there? What happened? Where are they now? In the forest, we would go down these paths, and quite often I would find birds mainly. And I would pick up these little birds, and they were perfect. There was nothing wrong with them. Their little bodies were just as beautiful as could be, yet they had no life to them. While my friends were running around gathering sticks to build forts and stuff, or whatever we were doing, I was over on the side holding this bird. As I would hold this bird, my hands would start being warm, and then they would get very hot. It was almost as if I was trying to infuse life back into this bird, or inherently knowing that even though this body lays motionless and lifeless in my hands, there was something more going on. I was always a different child. I was adopted into my family, and I wasn't like anybody else. And my family were staunch Christian Scientists. This being that we never really celebrated anything, and church was very maudlin, and it was very low key. And even though, as I in later years, as I grew up, and I realized, as my grandparents basically raised me, they became matriarchs in the church. They were registered healers with the Mother Church in Boston, and my grandmother was a first and second reader in the church. So they were very involved in this, but never once was it ever mentioned that the founder of Christian Science was Mary Baker Eddy, a medium, quite an outstanding medium in her right. She seemed to diminish her mediumship skills and going that direction when she started the Christian Science Church. But I digress. That's just a little history of who I am and where I come from, and why I think I even began to even have this fascination of something way beyond what anybody would ever talk about. Sunday school was just staunch, and it was boring, and my Sunday school teacher had the worst halitosis, bad breath, that would definitely reach across the table, and it made Sunday school a real workout. So inherently, I didn't pay attention to anything that they were saying. And somewhere along the line with my grandmother who helped raise me, I had this gentle guidance that yes, yeah, Marty, there's something more to what we've got going on here, this 3D existence. So, cut to where I'm at today in my life. As we've all gotten to where we are, every single thing that we've been through has taken us to who we are today. Nothing happens by accident. Yes, we have free will, but my life path led me to Cassadaga. I had a perfect life in South Florida. I was there for 18 years in this beautiful house that I had just finished up. And it was perfect. My life was perfect. I had everything until I came here, and that which was asleep in me from childhood was suddenly awakened again, and it came with absolute fervor. So I closed my life down, moved to Cassadaga, and I have to tell you, when I first walked into the camp back in 2013, in the fall, I said, well, what's this building? As I walked into the bookstore, and everybody goes, well, this is the Andrew Jackson Davis building. And I thought, well, okay, who's Andrew Jackson Davis? In all of my spiritual involvement, even since a child, no one had ever gone into what real spiritualism is, because basically Christian Science is spiritualism, just with a different title. So when I entered the student program, I had the absolute luck and good fortune of coming across a woman who agreed to be my CE, my certified evaluator, who was going to take me through my student program, Reverend Judy Cooper. I feel very honored to have such an individual helping guide me through my education. One of the things that she did when I first started working with her is that she handed me one of her personal books, The History of Spiritualism. This is a book written by Arthur Conan Doyle. And I said, okay, it's 2 books in one. It's a fat book. I looked at that and went, oh my God, I got to read that. And I said, yeah, you know what? My agreement with my CE is that I'll do what she tells me to, because that's why she is what she is to me. And so with honor and respect, I opened that book and I started to read it. And to be honest with you, I couldn't put it down. I've always been a bit of a history buff. I really enjoy learning things, and especially the things that I'm very involved in. The first chapter of this book blew me away. Very first chapter in the first book. And that is about a gentleman who they consider the forerunner of modern spiritualism. Does anybody out there know who Emanuel Swedenborg is? Raise your hands, anybody? Cool. See, a few of you do. Well, I didn't. As a child, growing up in Minnesota, Swedenborg was the Swedenborg buffet, which served Swedish food. And I cannot make that up because that's the truth. So I was fascinated by that in and of itself. And I went, well, okay, let me read about this. Let me dive into Swedenborg. So if you will entertain me, I'm going to read just a little bit out of this book. And I found it was a whole lot easier to put it on my iPad. All right. The story of Swedenborg. It is impossible to give any date for the early appearances of external intelligent power of a higher or lower type impinging on the affairs of men. Spiritualists are in the habit of taking March 31st, 1848, as the beginning of all psychic things because their own movement dates from that day. There has, however, been no time in the recorded history of the world when we do not find traces and a recognition of them from humanity. In other words, traces of spiritualism are in the hieroglyphs in Egypt. They're in the Mayan temples. They're in the Chinese writings. It's always been known. The earliest recorded history of humans has always mentioned death and dying and what happens to the soul. So it takes us to the Middle Ages or beyond them. It was still a very antiquated viewpoint until Emanuel Swedenborg came on. And he came forward as known as the great Swedish seer. Emanuel Swedenborg has some claim to be the father of our new knowledge of spiritual happenings. So when Swedenborg came out with what I'm about to introduce you to, the old church was still very much wrapped up in the rhetoric of all the old paintings where whatever happened in life past where we are here, beyond our 3D existence, was mainly cherubs, thrones, and thorns. If you recollect the churches back in the old days and their paintings, they depicted in the churches where great art was developed, they depicted life on the other side as quite controversial as opposed to what Emanuel Swedenborg came up with. And let's see, Arthur Conan Doyle goes on to further explain, in order to fully understand Swedenborg, one would need to have a Swedenborg brain. And that is not met with once in a century. In fact, he's the forerunner of it. No one came out with any of this. And yet our power of comparison of our experience of facts which Swedenborg knew nothing, we can realize some part of his life more clearly than he could himself. The object of this study is not to treat the man as a whole, but to endeavor to place him in the general scheme of psychic unfolding treated in this work, from which his own church and its narrowness would not hold him. In other words, he busted out of the mold, and not without a lot of controversy too. People weren't ready to hear this. People were very comfortable in what they had been told and taught this whole time, centuries. And he said, no, this is not what it's all about. Skipping ahead a few pages, he found then that the other world, that which is on the other side, to which we all go after death, consisted of a number of different spheres representing various shades of luminosity and happiness. Each of us going to that which our spiritual condition has fitted us. We are judged in automatic fashion. Like going to like by some spiritual law, like attracting like, in other words, and the result being determined by the total results of our life. He says that so absolution or a deathbed repentance can be of little avail. He found in these spheres that the scenery and conditions of this world were closely reproduced. And so was the general framework of society. In other words, if you were not a nice person, did a lot of bad things when you were alive, that deathbed repentance or suddenly turning to spirituality and to God was of no avail to you. You were judged as a whole. And then those of us that are generally on the right path, we would be judged by our life that we lived here in its entirety, not by the few things that might have gone wrong, especially if we've learned from them, which actually brought a lot of people a lot of solace. So that's not what the old church taught. He found houses in which families lived, temples in which they worshiped, halls in which they assembled for social purposes, palaces in which the rulers might dwell. In other words, he's trying to explain to people that life on the other side is very much like what we experience here, but without the rhetoric. Essentially, what Swedenborg was trying to display and make people understand or help people to understand is that we don't die, we're not from here. That this is merely a stop or a choice that we've made to come and incarnate here. Death was made easy by the presence of celestial beings who helped the newcomer into his fresh existence. Such newcomers had an immediate period of complete rest. They regained consciousness in a few days of our time. In other words, what he was stating is that when we cross over, we are greeted by those that have guided us the whole time we've been here. Our loved ones, our spirit guides, angels, they are all very real, and they are there to greet you and help you reacclimate to where we originally come from. Now, he also says that within a few days' time, you have a resting period. On the other side, from my other studies that I have learned, and this is simply coming from my perspective, mind you, everyone may have a different opinion about this, but I truly have come to the conclusion that there is no such thing as time, not as we administer it here on this side of existence. We are ageless, timeless beings in a 3D atmosphere. When you cross over to the other side, their time frame and time work is not as ours is here. But as Swedenborg said, there's a few days of rest period. And he goes on to explain, we did not change in any way at death. Man has lost nothing by death, but was still a man in all respects, though more perfect than in the whole body, than this 3D existence, more perfect. He took with him not only his powers, but also his acquired modes of thought, his beliefs, and he goes on to say, and his prejudices, which back in the day just meant his opinions. In other words, you don't change. You continue to be who you are, only with a little more enlightenment. We come here to ascend, to expand. We come here to learn things. Some people like to call it a school. I think that's a little boxed in. I think that's a little rigid. It was an absolute definite choice for each one of us in our life between lives where we are originally from to make the decision to reincarnate here. And dare I say that we've reincarnated many, many times with the same people over and over again. And he also goes on to explain what Swedenborg said. He says, there was marriage in the form of spiritual union in the next world. It takes a man and a woman to make a complete human unit. Swedenborg, it may be admitted, that was never married in his lifetime. But what he observed on the other side were marriages that were good, remained good, if they were within the same spiritual condition and they got along and they remained together. But there are those then that remain in marriages or couplings that it's not good. And for whatever 3D existence reason that they're staying with this other person for fear of being alone or for money or the children, whatever it may be, when they cross over, they need not carry that relationship any further. They are absolved of it. There was no detail too small for Swedenborg's observation in the spirit spheres. He speaks of the architecture, the artisan's work, the flowers and the fruits, the scribes, the embroidery, the art, the music, the literature, the science, the schools, the museums, the colleges and libraries, and the sports. It may all shock conventional minds, though why harps and crowns and thorns and thrones, as was depicted by the old church, and other less material things denied, it's hard to see. A lot of people had a lot of hard times picking up on that. It's almost as if the rhetoric of the church, governed by man, developed by man, was there to conceivably control man by throwing the fear of death and dying. And they depicted it quite well for many centuries. Those who left this world old, decrepit, diseased, or deformed renewed their youth and gradually assumed their full vigor. Married couples continued together if their feelings toward the other were close and sympathetic, like I was saying. If not, the marriage was dissolved. Quote, two real lovers are not separated by the death of one, since the spirit of the deceased dwells with the spirit of the survivor, and this even to the death of the survivor. When they again meet and are reunited and love each other more tenderly than before. Wow, that tells me a lot about how amazing life on the other side, where we all are from, truly is. It's fair, it's just, it's peaceful, it's happy. It's not at all what the fear mongers would like you to believe. When the spiritualist movement broke out in 1848, and when men like Andrew Jackson Davis supported Emanuel Swedenborg and his philosophic writings and psychic powers, which can be hardly distinguished from those of his predecessor. In other words, Andrew Jackson Davis came on the scene, and he supported Emanuel Swedenborg. Only Andrew Jackson Davis gave even greater credence to what Emanuel Swedenborg was conveying to the masses. Andrew Jackson Davis, in his own right, was one of the most prolific writers of spiritualism. He took what Emanuel Swedenborg had introduced to everybody and brought it to the forefront, even with more clarity and detail that Swedenborg had not yet conveyed. He goes on to say that every spiritualist should honor Swedenborg, and his bust should be in every spiritualist temple as being the first and greatest of modern mediums. And right next to it should be Andrew Jackson Davis. So when I read this book, on the third chapter, it is all about Andrew Jackson Davis, and it's in great detail about him. And Arthur Conan Doyle does a great job in explaining all of these different people. But what really got me is that my focus was mainly on Andrew Jackson Davis, because like I mentioned earlier, when I came into this camp, I had absolutely no idea who Andrew Jackson Davis was or why was a building named after him. Okay, I want to know. As I read further within this book about Andrew Jackson Davis, this book was brought up, this part of his writings. Andrew Jackson Davis wrote so much that he could fill a library. A very prolific writer. This book is called The Great Harmonia. It is the first book, you can see how fat it is. It is the first book in a series of 6 that he wrote. This is one of his first offerings to the world. In The Great Harmonia, he speaks of what happens with the spirit after dying. What happens? Well, I continue to go back to the chapter about Swedenborg, since Andrew Jackson Davis was dovetailing into what Swedenborg had offered. Paulin was a friend of Emanuel Swedenborg, and he speaks of his friends passing in this way. Speaking of Paulin's death, the seer, Emanuel Swedenborg, quote, says, "He died on Monday and spoke with me on Thursday. I was invited to the funeral. He saw the hearse. He saw them let down the coffin into the grave. He conversed with me as it was going on, that he would, asking me why they had buried him when he was alive. When the priest pronounced that he would rise again at the day of judgment, Paulin asked why was that when he had risen already. He wondered that such a belief could obtain, considering that he was even now alive. I continue further. This is entirely in accord with the experience of a present day medium, such as the mediums we have in this camp. If Swedenborg was within his right to pronounce all of this, so is the medium of today. Again, another friend of Swedenborg's, his name was Bra, quote, Bra was beheaded at 10 in the morning and he spoke to me at 10 that night. He was with me almost without interruption for several days. Wow. Now, I don't know about any of the rest of you, but I have had this experience not once, but many times. I've had it with relatives, friends, grandparents of those of friends of mine. I've had it with animals, my dogs, my cats. They all came to me after they crossed. Swedenborg describes this gentleman of his friend, Paulin. He describes him standing there with him at his own funeral. I will share with you what's happened with me, one of the most profound experiences that I had occur within my lifetime. My father passed away between Thanksgiving and Christmas. I loved my father very much. But we had a bit of a strained relationship, but it didn't matter. I loved him anyway. He was buried in the middle of a snowstorm, as we call up in Minnesota, a whiteout, in Cold Springs, Minnesota, one afternoon. The tent covered the area in which his coffin was to be dropped into the ground. Everybody there bid their adieu. I was the last one. The storm was raging. There was one funeral director shivering and holding himself in the corner of this tent. And I stood in front of my father's coffin. And I said, you better let me know you're okay. You better come to me. I want you to come to me, and I want you to show me, I want you to tell me that you are okay. Because I love you more than I've ever loved anyone. And I gotta know. I just gotta know. Thank you, Dad. I'll talk to you later. Bye for now. And I left, got in the car and went off to the celebration of life and all the food and everything, and the snow continued. Cut to 2 days later when I was leaving, coming back to Florida. I took the earliest flight I could get out of the Minneapolis airport. I was in the C concourse at 5:30 in the morning, and dare I say, it was me and a handful of other people. And I was always in the habit of arriving early, so there really wasn't anybody around. So I'm at the very end of this concourse, and I'm in the ladies' room. Now, I'm standing in the mirror, washing my hands, doing my thing, and suddenly I see in front of me a shadowed outline of a head and shoulders and halfway down the torso. Petite, not big. I'm standing and I'm looking at it. And I'm like, in my mind, yeah, I see this. Okay. I proceeded to finish up doing what I was doing, and then I glanced back up and I noticed from the shadow came my father to the right. There he was, smiling, bright, handsome, sporting his favorite beard, his perfect hair. His skin was perfect. He was in Technicolor just about. And he had this smile on him and this conversation, and everything that he was in goodness and in love came through to me, conveyed to me through his shining, bright blue eyes. His eyes were so bright blue. Here they were blue anyway, but like I said, it was nearly Technicolor. And he just sat there, stood there in the mirror in front of me. And I said, yeah. Took me about a minute. 45 seconds to a minute he was there. And that's a long time when you're standing there in the mirror trying to realize what's going on. I was squinting my eyes, taking my glasses on and off, and I finally just went, that's him. Thank you, Dad. I love you too. And as soon as I said that, he just faded away. I don't know about any of the rest of you, but in my experience in this, that proved to me beyond a shadow of a doubt, my father was at his own funeral. I was a little wrapped up in the grief and all the rhetoric of everybody else who just didn't see things the way I did, or had that inherent knowing that there is more to this existence than what we have right now. That we go to a place where we originate from, that it's real. There's no doubt. I've had my cats at the vet when I needed to bring them in. And I never once let them to the vet to do it on their own. I always held them. And as they crossed, I would breathe them in. I would feel them. And I always felt them pass through me. In one incident, I was driving back from putting my little cat Sammy down, and I didn't really feel what I had felt with everyone else, the others that I had done. I have been in the vet uncountable times in helping animals cross over, dogs and cats. Uncountable. It's what I'm here for. I find it a privilege and an honor, but this time was different. I didn't feel Sammy come through me. And I went, well, this is okay. All right. So as I'm in my van driving home, which was a very short distance, I'm just driving along, and suddenly, out of my control, coming out of my mouth, from the inner core of my soul, my insides, was Sammy's soul. Literally just came out of my mouth, and I could smell and taste tuna. Now, granted, I didn't have tuna for lunch that day, and tuna was her favorite. And for a brief moment, I could feel her in the van with me. And I went, son of a gun. You know, crossing over for everyone, every animal, is going to be it's going to be different for everyone. The reception of it, the feel of it is always it's as individual as a snowflake or a fingerprint. I've had my cats at night. There was one other kitty, and I will wrap this up with this, but there was a kitty named Buckwheat. He was my dear black Oriental short hair. And he did not want to go down. It took 2 vials of purple juice. And it was harrowing. I was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Maybe he's not ready. But he did. He crossed over. But again, I didn't feel his soul penetrate mine, as I've done with so many of the others. That night, sitting in my bed, watching TV, I'm sitting on the edge of my bed because I'm just a little bit unrested with everything that had occurred that day. It's never easy to say goodbye to a family member, ever. Should never be taken lightly, no matter what it is. And suddenly I noticed out of the corner of my eye, this black, my room was dark, but it was darker than dark. It was blacker than black. I don't know how else to describe it. In the right-hand corner, and I had this feeling of love immediately when I saw it. And it came right at me, and it swooped down at me. And I remember leaning over so it wouldn't hit me. And I went, oh my gosh. Thank you, Buckwheat. Now, standing up here and revealing this, is nothing short of being incredibly vulnerable and up for criticism. At this point in my belief in who I am, and what I'm turning into and developing into, bring it on. I'm only too happy to be able to share this with you all. I would like to ask, in wrapping up, has anybody else out there here ever had anything of that nature, of that experience? Have you? All right. Thank you. Thank you. In closing, I want to say to each and every one of you what a pleasure and what an honor it is to stand before you and to share this modicum of belief that I have. I try to stay very humble about what I've experienced. I do my diligence by not talking about it, most of all, never, ever bragging about it or placing it upon anybody else. My experience in my life from my earliest memories have been unlike anyone I've ever met until I got here. Then I met. When I was growing up, I was called the black sheep. When I got here to Casadagan, I found the rest of the herd. I'm very happy to say. Now, in conclusion about Emanuel Swedenborg and Andrew Jackson Davis and what Arthur Conan Doyle says, in spite of all the theological symbolism, Swedenborg's name must live eternally as the first of all modern men who have given a description of the process of death and of the world beyond, which is not founded upon the vague, ecstatic, and impossible visions of the old churches, but which actually corresponds with the descriptions which we ourselves obtain from those who endeavor to convey back to us some clear idea of their new existence. Bottom line, my dears, we don't die. Period. We're not from here. I always say I come back here because the food's so good. I like to eat. So in closing, again, I thank you for honoring me to sit here and listen to what I have to say. And I hope maybe a small bit of what I shared today maybe opens a door for somebody or allows them to feel comfortable in their own skin about what they've experienced. Because it's all good, kids. We're all in this together. We're all united. We're all from the same source. And in that I say, thank you.
He had a church, they had a church on his environment downtown Lake Helen. The ironic part of this is that church was surrounded by Methodist, Baptist, all the real heavy Christian religions, but they survived down